In September 1327, something happened inside the walls of Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire that the official record has never quite been able to explain. A king of England died. His body was presented for viewing, with a face peaceful enough to suggest natural causes. His death was announced as sudden illness. And within weeks, the most lurid and specific rumour in the entire history of English royal murder had already begun circulating through the courts of Europe. That Edward II had been killed with a red-hot poker inserted into his body through a horn, so that no mark would show on the outside, a method so deliberate and so theatrical in its cruelty that it reads less like an improvised murder and more like a message. And the question that historians have been unable to fully answer for nearly 700 years is whether that message was real, or whether it was the message that someone very powerful needed the world to believe had been sent. Before we go further, if you want history that forensically examines the official record and finds what it is hiding, subscribe and leave a like right now, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about one of the most infamous deaths in English history. Edward II was not a man who made it easy to be his subject, his ally or his queen. He had spent his entire reign of 19 years making choices that his barons, his parliament, his wife, and his own chroniclers found at various points baffling, infuriating, and genuinely dangerous, showering royal estates and titles on his personal favourite Piers Gaveston, to such an extreme degree that the English baronage eventually captured Gaveston and executed him without trial, then watching Edward repeat the entire pattern with a second favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose influence over the king became so total and so resented that it eventually produced the coalition that destroyed Edward entirely, his own wife. Queen Isabella of France, married to Edward at the age of 12, systematically stripped of her lands and income, which were transferred to Hugh Despenser's household, treated by her husband with what contemporary chronicles describe as open contempt, had by 1325 developed a relationship with the exiled English baron Roger Mortimer that was close enough and politically consequential enough to constitute, regardless of its precise personal nature, a functional partnership directed entirely at removing her husband from the throne of England. And in September 1326, she and Mortimer invaded England from France with a force so small it should have been easily defeated, but instead triggered an almost immediate collapse of support for Edward II, as his lords, his bishops, and finally his own son abandoned him to his fate. Edward II was captured in Wales in November 1326, stripped of the Great Seal of England, and imprisoned first at Kenilworth Castle, where he was persuaded or forced, depending on which source you trust, to abdicate his throne in January 1327, in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III, with his mother Isabella and Roger Mortimer governing as the effective rulers of England in the new king's name. And the deposed Edward was then transferred to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where he remained for the approximately 8 months between his arrival in April 1327 and the announcement of his death in September of that year. Here is the first detail that makes the official account of Edward's death impossible to simply accept at face value. The conditions at Berkeley Castle during the months of his imprisonment were, according to multiple contemporary sources, specifically designed not to kill him outright, but to break his health through sustained physical suffering, with accounts describing rotting animal carcasses thrown into the pit beneath his cell to poison the air he breathed, inadequate food, inadequate warmth, and the deliberate creation of conditions that his captors apparently hoped would produce a death that could be attributed to natural causes and spare them the political problem of having visibly murdered a king. The political problem of murdering Edward II was not small. He was still anointed, still regarded by significant portions of the English population as the legitimate king. Regardless of his forced abdication, his son Edward III sat on a throne whose legitimacy depended partly on the fiction that the transfer of power had been voluntary rather than coerced. And anyone who killed the deposed king directly risked being accused of the murder of an anointed monarch, a crime with both political and theological consequences so severe that even Mortimer and Isabella, who had every practical reason to want Edward dead, needed the death to be deniable, in a way that a simple assassination could never be. Pay attention to this because it is the specific political logic that explains everything that follows. The people who wanted Edward II dead could not afford to have him obviously murdered, which means they needed either a death that looked natural or a method of killing that left no mark. And the specific legend of the red-hot poker is so perfectly designed to satisfy both of these requirements simultaneously that historians who examine it carefully find themselves asking whether the story was invented to explain what actually happened or whether it was invented to conceal what actually happened. And the distinction between those two possibilities produces completely different historical conclusions. The primary source for the red-hot poker account is not a contemporary chronicle written by someone who was present at Berkeley Castle or who had reliable information about what happened there. It is a chronicle written by Geoffrey Le Baker, approximately 20 years after Edward's death, a source that is known to be sympathetic to Edward II and hostile to Isabella and Mortimer, that contains multiple passages that other contemporary sources do not corroborate, and that presents the poker account with a specificity of physical detail that reads less like documentary history and more like a rhetorical construction designed to maximize the moral outrage directed at the men who carried out the deed and the woman who ordered it. Geoffrey Le Baker's specific account describes Mortimer's agents, Thomas Gurney and William Ogle, holding Edward down with a large table while a horn was inserted and a red-hot iron spit was introduced through the horn into his body, the method specifically designed to cause internal damage, fatal enough to kill him, while leaving no visible wound on the external surface of the body. And this description is so physically precise and so theatrically horrible that it has dominated the historical imagination of Edward II's death for nearly 7 centuries. But when you examine the other contemporary sources that should corroborate it, what you find is not corroboration, but a striking and consistent silence. The most important contemporary source on Edward II's death is not Geoffrey Le Baker, it is Adam Murrumouth, a chronicler who was actually present at the English royal court during the events of 1327, who had access to official documents and reliable eyewitness accounts, and who recorded Edward's death at Berkeley Castle as a fact while noting explicitly that different people said different things about how he died, some attributing it to natural causes, some suggesting suffocation, some other means without mentioning the red-hot poker at all, a silence that is historically significant, precisely because Murrumouth was not a supporter of Isabella and Mortimer and had no obvious political reason to suppress the most damning version of the story if he had heard it from credible sources. Here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, and stay with this because it changes the entire framework within which the red-hot poker question needs to be understood, because the historical record does not simply present a choice between the poker story being true and it being false. It presents a third possibility that is in some ways more disturbing than either of those options. The possibility that Edward II did not die at Berkeley Castle in September 1327 at all, and that the entire question of how he was killed is based on a false premise, because the death itself may have been staged. The evidence for the staged death theory centres on a remarkable document known as the Fieschi letter, a letter written by Manuel de Fieschi, a Genoese notary and later Bishop of Vercelli who had connections to the English royal court, addressed to Edward III and describing in specific detail how Edward II had escaped from Berkeley Castle, made his way across England and then across Europe, lived for a period as a hermit in France and then in Italy, and had personally confessed this account to Fieschi himself, a document so specific in its geographic and biographical details, and so difficult to explain as pure invention, that it has never been definitively dismissed by any serious historian who has examined it carefully. The Fieschi letter describes Edward's escape from Berkeley Castle as occurring after the death of one of his servants, implying that the body buried and presented for viewing as Edward's was actually someone else's, and then traces his journey through Corfe Castle, Ireland, France, and ultimately to Italy, where Fieschi claims to have met him personally at a hermitage near Milan. And what makes this account particularly difficult to dismiss is not merely the geographic specificity, but the fact that archaeological excavations in the 20th century at the specific location in Italy where Fieschi places Edward discovered evidence of a medieval English inhabitant, exactly consistent with the timeline the letter describes. The official response to the Fieschi letter by Edward III's government was silence. No denial, no investigation, no public statement that the letter was false, and historians who have studied this silence have interpreted it in 2 completely opposite ways. Some argue that silence indicates the letter was so obviously false that it required no refutation. Others argue that silence indicates the letter contained information that Edward III knew to be true or plausible, and that he had strong political reasons not to publicly acknowledge, since admitting that his father was alive and living as a hermit in Italy would retroactively delegitimize both the forced abdication of 1327 and subsequent actions of his own government. The specific physical evidence from Berkeley Castle itself does nothing to resolve the question. The castle survives and can be visited today. The room where Edward was reportedly held has been identified, but the physical space tells you nothing about what happened inside it, because the evidence that would settle the question is not architectural, but documentary. And the documentary record is precisely what has been managed, suppressed, or lost in the nearly 7 centuries since September 1327, leaving historians working with a set of sources that are uniformly compromised either by political bias, temporal distance from the events, or both. The two men most directly implicated in the physical killing of Edward II, Thomas Gurney and William Ogle, had careers after 1327 that are themselves historically interesting, because Gurney was eventually tracked down in Europe by agents of Edward III and died before he could be brought back to England to face trial, a convenient death that prevented him from testifying about what had actually happened at Berkeley Castle, while Ogle received a royal pardon and died peacefully in England. A disparity in treatment so striking that it has led some historians to speculate that Ogle's pardon reflected not his lesser involvement in the murder, but his cooperation with an official version of events that the government needed maintained. The body presented for public viewing after Edward's death was displayed with the face visible and reportedly showed no signs of violence or distress, which is consistent with the red-hot poker story, in the specific sense that the method was allegedly chosen to leave no external marks, but is also equally consistent with death by other means that left no external marks, including suffocation, poisoning, or natural illness. And the medieval practice of embalming and presenting royal bodies in ways that minimised the visible signs of whatever had actually caused death means that the viewing itself provides essentially no forensic information about the method. Roger Mortimer's fate offers an instructive parallel to the question of what happened to Edward II, because when Edward III seized Mortimer at Nottingham Castle in October 1330, crawling through a secret tunnel with 22 companions, capturing Mortimer in the room where he slept, while Isabella reportedly looked on, begging her son to spare her lover, he had Mortimer tried and executed for a list of crimes that conspicuously did not include the murder of Edward II by red-hot poker, charging him instead with assuming royal power, causing discord between Edward II and his queen, and the murder of the Earl of Kent, a specific omission that has struck historians as curious if the poker story was both true and known to Edward III at the time of the trial. The Earl of Kent episode is one of the most revealing details in the entire Edward II story, and one of the least covered. Edmund of Kent, Edward II's own half-brother, was executed by Mortimer in 1330, specifically because he had been attempting to organise a rescue of Edward II from captivity, and the specific charge against him was that he believed Edward II was still alive and was conspiring to free him, a belief that Mortimer's government treated as treasonous rather than delusional, which raises the obvious question of why a government that had murdered Edward II 3 years earlier, in 1327, would treat as credible the accusation that he was still alive, rather than simply pointing to his documented death and dismissing the entire conspiracy as based on false information. Modern forensic historians who have examined the Edward II case have generally concluded that the red-hot poker story, as recorded by Geoffrey Le Baker, is almost certainly embellished and possibly entirely invented as political propaganda, that the cause of death was more likely suffocation, which would explain both the lack of external marks and the accounts of screaming heard from the castle that contemporary sources mention, and that the Fieschi letter, while not proving that Edward escaped, contains enough verifiable detail and unexplained specificity to remain a genuine historical mystery rather than a dismissible forgery, leaving the case of Edward II's death in the specific category of historical events where the honest answer is that the evidence does not permit certainty in any direction. The cultural power of the red-hot poker story, the reason it has persisted for nearly 7 centuries as the definitive account of Edward II's death, despite being poorly sourced, politically motivated, and forensically implausible, tells you something important about how historical memory actually works, because the story is so perfectly shaped to communicate a specific moral judgment about Isabella and Mortimer, so precisely calibrated to produce outrage and sympathy in equal measure, so theatrically appropriate as a punishment for a king whose personal life had been the subject of scandal, that it functions less as historical record and more as a morality tale that medieval and early modern audiences found so satisfying that they preserved and repeated it regardless of its evidentiary basis. Christopher Marlowe understood this perfectly when he wrote his play Edward II in 1592, making the poker scene the dramatic and emotional climax of the entire work, the moment towards which all of the play's political tragedy builds. The image that his audience would carry out of the theatre and remember long after the political details had faded, and the fact that Marlowe's theatrical version of the story became, for several centuries, more influential on public understanding of Edward II's death than any historian's careful analysis of the primary sources illustrates exactly how stories about the past work. The version that is most dramatically satisfying tends to become the version that survives, regardless of whether it is the version that is most historically accurate. The lasting significance of the Edward II case is not finally the question of whether the red-hot poker was used, a question that the historical record, for all its richness, cannot definitively answer, but what the uncertainty itself reveals about the nature of medieval royal power and the specific problem of killing a king. Because Edward II's story demonstrates with unusual clarity that the murder of an anointed monarch required not just the physical act of killing, but the creation of a narrative around that act that was politically survivable. And the red-hot poker story, whether it describes what actually happened or whether it was invented to describe what people needed to believe had happened, served that narrative function so effectively that it is still doing its work nearly 7 centuries later, still shaping how people understand what happened in Berkeley Castle in September 1327, still making it impossible to look at the historical record of those weeks without the story colouring everything you see. And if that specific kind of historical uncertainty, the kind where the official story is almost certainly wrong, but the true story is buried under 7 centuries of managed evidence and political narrative, is the kind that holds you, the kind where the question itself is more disturbing than any definitive answer could be, then you already know what this channel is for, because there are more stories like this one waiting. More official accounts that do not survive forensic examination, more deaths that were too convenient, more bodies that were displayed too carefully, more silences in the historical record that say more than the words around them. And those are the stories we tell here in full, without softening and without looking away.